What do you do when you're the last English king to die in battle and your enemies want to erase you from history? Well, if you're Richard III, you end up buried under parking space R in Leicester. In 2012, archaeologists actually found his skeleton right there under a car park. And yeah, Philippa Langley swears the letter R was like some cosmic joke about his name. For over 500 years, people were walking over this guy's grave to get their morning coffee, completely clueless that England's most notorious monarch was rotting away 6 feet under their fiesta. Successive events under Tudor rule and later demolition buried his memory so completely that solving this 500-year mystery required some serious detective work. But before we get to how they cracked the case, you need to understand exactly what kind of guy we're dealing with here. Richard III was basically that guy who thought he had main character energy, except with actual royal blood and way more murder accusations. This dude had serious main character syndrome before that was even a thing. He probably looked in the mirror every morning thinking, today's the day I prove everyone wrong about me. Here's a guy who clawed his way to the throne in 1483. He's accused of killing his own nephews to get there. Historians still debate it. 2 young princes just mysteriously vanish right after their uncle becomes king. That's some serious coincidence right there. The princes in the tower disappeared faster than your will to live during a Monday morning meeting. Richard was like, yeah, those kids just wandered off somewhere, nothing to see here, folks. The guy literally had Shakespeare write him as the ultimate villain centuries later. That's like getting roasted by history's greatest playwright for all eternity. Shakespeare really said, let me make this dude the most evil character anyone's ever seen on stage. Richard gets portrayed as this twisted, hunchbacked monster who kills people for fun. The skeleton actually shows he had scoliosis, not the theatrical hunchback but Tudor propaganda, and later writers cemented that twisted villain image. Most kings get epic poems about their victories, but Richard gets turned into a pantomime villain that people boo at for 400 years. Richard thought he was starting his hero's journey when he became king at age 30. You know how every story has that moment where the underdog finally gets his shot? Richard probably thought that was him in 1483. Finally, the crown was his after years of playing second fiddle to his brother Edward IV. He's thinking, this is it, this is where I prove I was meant to rule England. He ruled for exactly 2 years before everything went sideways. 2 years. That's basically the medieval equivalent of getting fired from your dream job during the probation period. Most kings get decades to mess things up, but Richard managed to lose everything in 24 months. He spent longer planning his coronation than he actually spent being king. That's got to hurt your ego a bit. The Battle of Bosworth field in 1485 was supposed to be his moment to prove he deserved the crown. This was Richard's big chance to show everyone he wasn't just some usurper. He probably woke up that morning thinking, today I'm going to smash Henry Tudor and his rebel army. Then everyone will see I'm the rightful king. Instead, it became his final boss fight. And spoiler alert, he lost hard. Contemporary accounts say he fought bravely though. The guy charged straight at Henry Tudor's forces like he was in some epic movie scene. This 32-year-old king in full armor, crown on his head, riding straight into enemy lines like he's going to single-handedly win the battle. That takes serious guts, you got to give him credit for that. No hiding in the back giving orders for Richard, he went full Braveheart mode. But here's the thing about real life though. Sometimes the hero doesn't win. Sometimes the guy who thinks he's the hero is actually the villain in someone else's story. Henry Tudor wasn't just some random rebel, he had legitimate claims to the throne too. Plus he had French backing and way more popular support than Richard ever did. When you've been accused of murdering kids to become king, people tend to root for the other guy. Richard's call to adventure ended with him face down in a muddy field. All that planning, all that scheming, all those years thinking he was destined for greatness, and it ends with him getting his skull caved in at Bosworth Field. The guy literally had Shakespeare write him as the ultimate villain centuries later. That's like getting roasted by history's greatest playwright for all eternity. Shakespeare really said, let me make this dude the most evil character anyone's ever seen on stage. Richard gets portrayed as this twisted, hunchbacked monster who kills people for fun. The skeleton actually shows he had scoliosis, not the theatrical hunchback but Tudor propaganda, and later writers cemented that twisted villain image. Most kings get epic poems about their victories, but Richard gets turned into a pantomime villain that people boo at for 400 years. Richard thought he was starting his hero's journey when he became king at age 30. You know how every story has that moment where the underdog finally gets his shot? Richard probably thought that was him in 1483. Finally, the crown was his after years of playing second fiddle to his brother Edward IV. He's thinking, this is it, this is where I prove I was meant to rule England. He ruled for exactly 2 years before everything went sideways. 2 years. That's basically the medieval equivalent of getting fired from your dream job during the probation period. Most kings get decades to mess things up, But Richard managed to lose everything in 24 months. He spent longer planning his coronation than he actually spent being king. That's got to hurt your ego a bit. The Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485 was supposed to be his moment to prove he deserved the crown. This was Richard's big chance to show everyone he wasn't just some usurper. He's probably woke up that morning thinking, today I'm going to smash Henry Tudor and his rebel army, then everyone will see I'm the rightful king. Instead, it became his final boss fight, and spoiler alert, he lost hard. Contemporary accounts say he fought bravely though. The guy charged straight at Henry Tudor's forces like he was in some epic movie scene, 32-year-old king in full armor, crown on his head, riding straight into enemy lines like he's going to single-handedly win the battle. That takes serious guts, you got to give him credit for that. No hiding in the back giving orders for Richard, he went full Braveheart mode. But here's the thing about real life though, sometimes the hero doesn't win. Sometimes the guy who thinks he's the hero is actually the villain in someone else's story. Henry Tudor wasn't just some random rebel, he had legitimate claims to the throne too. Plus he had French backing and way more popular support than Richard ever did. When you've been accused of murdering kids to become king, people tend to root for the other guy. Richard's call to adventure ended with him face down in a muddy field. All that planning, all that scheming, all those years thinking he was destined for greatness, and it ends with him getting his skull caved in at Bosworth Field. The last English king to die in battle, which sounds heroic until you realize he died because everyone hated him and wanted him gone. That's when his real journey into historical infamy began. Death was just the opening act for Richard's reputation getting absolutely destroyed for the next 500 years. What happened to his body after Bosworth Field would make everything that came before look like a warm-up act. So you just killed the king in battle, what's your next move? If you're Henry Tudor, apparently it's time to get creative with corpse humiliation. Most people would probably think, okay, we won, let's move on with our lives. But Henry looked at Richard's dead body and thought, you know what, I'm going to make an example out of this guy that nobody will ever forget. Contemporary accounts describe how Richard's body was stripped completely naked right there on the battlefield. The guy just died fighting for his crown, and before his blood even gets cold, Henry's men are ripping off his armor and clothes like he's some random peasant. Then they threw him over a horse like a sack of grain. Not even tied down properly, just draped over this horse's back with his arms and legs dangling. The skeleton found in 2012 actually shows wounds consistent with this kind of post-mortem humiliation, proving the historical sources weren't exaggerating. The Ballad of Bosworth Field describes how they put him on display in Newark. The poem says he was laid out where many people could look at him, which sounds poetic until you realize this was basically a medieval freak show. They propped up the naked dead king so crowds could come gawk at him like some twisted tourist attraction. I mean, imagine walking through town and there's just a dead king laid out for everyone to stare at. That's some serious psychological warfare right there. Polydore Virgil's Chronicle says Henry VII personally tarried for 2 days in Leicester while Richard's corpse was on display. You got to understand, medieval people needed receipts when it came to regime changes. You couldn't just announce the old king was dead and expect everyone to believe you. People wanted proof that Richard wasn't going to come back and reclaim his throne. So Henry's out there like, hey everyone, come see the dead guy, he's definitely not breathing anymore. That's some morbid showmanship if you ask me. This wasn't just disrespectful though, it was shocking even by 1485 standards. Most kings got formal rites with religious ceremonies and proper tombs, but Richard didn't get any of that. Contemporary sources say he was buried with no funeral solemnity at all. They just dug a hole at Greyfriars and threw him in there around August 25, 1485. No coffin, no ceremony, nothing. Henry VII even paid for a tomb in 1495, but that disappeared too when the monastery got demolished later. The Tudors wanted to send a message that Richard was so twisted he didn't deserve basic human decency even as a corpse. They were basically rewriting the rules of royal death to make Richard look like some kind of monster. It wasn't enough that they beat him in battle, they had to destroy his reputation too. Every person who saw his naked body being paraded around would remember that Richard III died like trash, not like a king. What really happened to Richard III's body after he died at Bosworth Field was a deliberate campaign of humiliation designed to erase his legitimacy as a king. Henry Tudor didn't just want to beat Richard, he wanted to make it so nobody would ever think of him as a proper monarch again. Every step of this process was calculated to destroy Richard's reputation and make the Tudor victory look inevitable. But the Tudors had no idea they were setting up one of history's greatest disappearing acts. Their plan to erase Richard from memory worked way better than they ever imagined it would. Here's where things get really weird though. The Greyfriars Priory was dissolved in 1538 under Henry VIII. The friary and its monument fell into ruin. The site changed hands and was subdivided over centuries and was eventually built over and turned into a staff car park by about 1944. Like they were so good at erasing this guy from history that they erased him from their own records too. That's some next level incompetence right there. You'd think someone would keep track of where they buried a king, right? I mean, even if you hate the guy, he's still technically royalty. But apparently medieval record keeping wasn't that great when you're trying to erase someone from history. The Tudors did such a thorough job of making Richard irrelevant that they forgot to write down basic stuff like, hey, the body is buried right here next to this wall. It's like they were playing some twisted game of hide and seek, except they hid the body so well they couldn't find it themselves. Local legends started popping up like medieval urban myths after that. You know how rumors spread when nobody knows the real story? Rumors later said they were thrown into the River Soar, but historians now think that story was probably a confused or mistaken 17th century claim. John Speed made this map in 1611 that showed Richard's grave overgrown with nettles and weeds, but he likely looked in the wrong place anyway. That sounds all poetic and mysterious, like something out of a Gothic novel, but it didn't help anyone actually find the guy. Speed basically drew a picture of some random patch of weeds and said, yeah, the king's probably under there somewhere. Real helpful, John. Thanks for the incredibly vague landmark that could describe half of England. There was this commemorative pillar that supposedly marked the location around 1612, but that had vanished by the 19th century too. I mean, imagine having one job mark where the dead king is buried, and you can't even keep track of the marker itself. By the time Victorian treasure hunters showed up looking for Richard, they had absolutely nothing to go on except folklore and confused maps. By the 1800s, people were getting desperate. They started digging up random bones near Bow Bridge, hoping to find the missing king. Victorian folks were obsessed with this mystery, probably because they had nothing better to do before television was invented. They'd find some old skeleton and get all excited thinking they'd solved the centuries-old puzzle, only to realize they just dug up some random medieval peasant. Sorry guys, that's just Bob the blacksmith, not your missing monarch. People were literally making stuff up at this point. Every old bone that turned up in Leicester became a potential Richard III sighting. It was like medieval Pokemon Go, except instead of catching cartoon creatures, Victorian treasure hunters were collecting random dead people, hoping one of them used to wear a crown. There was this one story about a tomb marker that supposedly existed in someone's garden. The thing allegedly read, "Here lies the body of Richard III, sometime King of England," which sounds official enough to be real. But that conveniently vanished too, probably when someone realized they had a dead king in their backyard and didn't want the hassle. I mean, imagine trying to explain that to your neighbors. Hey, just so you know, there's a medieval monarch buried next to my roses. Hope that's cool with everyone. How did England's most notorious monarch end up completely vanishing from history for over 500 years? The Tudors' humiliation campaign worked so well it erased all traces of his burial. They wanted Richard forgotten, and boy did they succeed. The guy went from being King of England to being completely lost like car keys or your motivation on Monday morning. The irony is that Henry VII wanted Richard forgotten, but making him disappear just made him more mysterious and legendary. Nothing makes people obsess over something like telling them they can't have it. The Tudors accidentally created the perfect historical mystery by being too good at erasing evidence. For centuries, people walked right over his grave without knowing they were literally stepping on royalty. Some poor medieval king was getting trampled by thousands of feet while everyone wondered where the heck he went. But Richard's problems were just getting started because his reputation was about to take an even bigger hit. Just when you think Richard III's reputation couldn't get any worse, along comes Shakespeare to absolutely destroy what was left of it. The Tudors already did a pretty solid job making this guy look terrible, but apparently that wasn't enough damage for William Shakespeare. This playwright looked at Richard's already trashed reputation and thought, you know what, I can make this way worse. Let me turn this dead king into the most evil character anyone's ever seen on stage. Shakespeare wrote Richard III about a century after the real king died, amplifying Tudor-era portrayals and turning Richard into a memorable theatrical villain. The real Richard probably had mild scoliosis, which is basically just a curved spine that lots of people have. The skeleton shows scoliosis, but no evidence of a withered arm like Shakespeare's play claims. It's not that big a deal. You probably wouldn't even notice it if you met the guy. But Shakespeare turned him into this hunchbacked monster who killed everyone in sight. He took a minor physical condition and turned it into this huge symbol of inner evil. That's like taking someone's crooked nose and deciding they must be a serial killer because of it. Shakespeare's Richard III is basically the medieval equivalent of every Disney villain rolled into one. You got the manipulative scheming, the murderous plots, the physical deformity that's supposed to represent moral corruption. This Richard doesn't just kill people, he enjoys it. He's out there monologuing about his evil plans like some cartoon bad guy. Shakespeare really went all out making this dude as unlikable as humanly possible. The play opens with Richard literally announcing he's going to be evil because he's ugly. I mean, that's some next-level character assassination right there. Most villains at least try to justify their actions or pretend they're doing the right thing. But Shakespeare's Richard just straight up says, since I'm deformed and nobody likes me, I'm going to be a monster. That's not character development, that's just lazy writing that makes Richard look like a psychopath. Lines like "now is the winter of our discontent" became famous quotes that everybody knows. Those words sound all poetic and dramatic when you hear them, but they also cemented Richard as history's ultimate bad guy. Every time someone quotes that line, they're basically reinforcing the idea that Richard III was this twisted villain who hated the world. Shakespeare gave Richard memorable dialogue that made him unforgettable for all the wrong reasons. For over 400 years, most people's knowledge of Richard III came from Shakespeare, not actual history books. Think about that for a second. Generations of people learned about this medieval king from a play written by a guy who wasn't even alive when Richard was. Tudor spin gave Shakespeare the raw material. Shakespeare made it unforgettable, so for centuries the public remembered the play, not the man. The Tudor propaganda was already working pretty well, but Shakespeare basically took it nuclear and made sure Richard would be hated forever. The Tudors wanted people to think Richard was a bad king, but Shakespeare made people think he was a monster who didn't deserve to be human. There's a difference between political propaganda and character assassination, and Shakespeare definitely crossed that line. He turned Tudor spin into theatrical entertainment that lasted centuries. Shakespeare cemented a caricature that outlived the facts. Political messages get forgotten when the politicians die, but great theatre lives forever. Shakespeare didn't just repeat Tudor talking points, he created this memorable villain that people would quote and perform for hundreds of years. Every time someone staged the play, they were basically spreading anti-Richard propaganda to a whole new audience. Even today, when people think of Richard III, they picture Shakespeare's villain, not the actual medieval king. Most folks couldn't tell you a single historical fact about the real Richard, but they know all about the hunchbacked murderer from the play. That's some serious cultural impact when your fictional version completely overwrites historical reality. Shakespeare basically rewrote this guy's entire legacy and made it stick. But here's the thing though, not even Shakespeare could predict his villain would end up under a parking spot. All that dramatic evil monologuing and theatrical villainy, and the guy ends up buried under someone's Honda Civic for 500 years. After centuries of wild theories and failed searches, it would take some serious detective work to finally solve this mystery. Enter Philippa Langley and the Looking for Richard project, launched in 2009 with a mission that sounded completely insane to most people. Langley was working on a screenplay about Richard III and got obsessed with the whole mystery. She wasn't some fancy professor with a bunch of degrees, just a regular person who got really into medieval history. But here's the thing, she actually convinced serious institutions to back her crazy idea. The Richard III Society supported her project, and she managed to persuade the University of Leicester and Leicester City Council to get on board with an actual archaeological excavation. Langley and her partners, including historian John Ashdown Hill, spent years doing detective work that would make Sherlock Holmes jealous. They used old maps, ground-penetrating radar, and some serious historical research to narrow down where Greyfriars used to be. The ground-penetrating radar surveys in August 2011 were basically useless because there was too much junk in the soil from old buildings getting torn down. But Langley had produced this medieval map of Leicester that showed exactly where the church used to sit. She spent years comparing old maps with modern street layouts, trying to figure out where a 500-year-old monastery would be in today's Leicester. The location they identified was now a mundane city council parking lot, which had to be the least royal resting place imaginable. You're looking for England's most notorious king, and your best guess is underneath a bunch of government workers' cars. The social services car park wasn't even some fancy downtown parking structure, just a regular boring lot where city employees left their vehicles while they processed paperwork all day. Richard III went from wearing a crown to being under a Honda Civic for 500 years. On day one of digging in August 2012, they literally found a skeleton with a curved spine and massive head trauma. Day one, the University of Leicester Archaeological Services team started their excavation on August 25th, and within hours they hit pay dirt. They dug this trench that was about 5 feet wide and almost 100 feet long, and boom, there's a skeleton right where the historical map suggested they'd find it. The spine was curved from scoliosis and the skull was completely smashed in. The remains were discovered in the choir area of the old Greyfriars Church, hastily buried without a coffin in a grave that was slightly too small for the body. No fancy wooden box, no ceremonial burial cloths, just a dead guy shoved into the dirt like garbage. The hands were in a position suggesting they may have been tied, though archaeologists can't be 100% certain about that. Even 500 years later, you could tell this burial was done fast and without any respect for the person being buried. The cosmic joke was that parking space R was literally right over where they found him, like the universe had a sense of humor about the whole thing. I mean, what are the odds that a king named Richard would end up under the letter R? That's either the most incredible coincidence in history, or someone up there was having a laugh at this whole situation. The skeleton showed brutal battle injuries that told the whole story of how Richard died. There was this massive blow to the back of the skull that would have cut right through to his brain. Someone hit this guy with something heavy and sharp, probably a halberd or big sword. Then there was another wound that went straight through his brain from a different angle. This wasn't just getting killed in battle, this was getting completely destroyed by multiple attackers who really wanted him dead. But finding bones with the right injuries in the right location is one thing. Proving they actually belonged to Richard III was going to require some serious scientific wizardry that nobody saw coming. The Leicester team went full forensic science mode with DNA testing, radiocarbon dating, isotope analysis, the whole 9 yards. This wasn't some basic archaeology dig anymore, this was like CSI Medieval Edition, with scientists running around doing tests that sound like they came from a crime show. The University of Leicester built their case on 6 major pillars of evidence that made identification beyond reasonable doubt. First, the location in the Choir of Greyfriars, exactly where historical maps suggested. Second, biological age of 30-34 matching Richard's death at 32. Third, spinal scoliosis consistent with contemporary descriptions. Fourth, multiple lethal cranial injuries matching battle accounts from 1485. Fifth, isotope evidence showing a high-status diet of luxury foods. Sixth, mitochondrial DNA matching living matrilineal descendants including Michael Ibsen and one other relative. They tracked down living descendants of Richard's sister Anne of York to get mitochondrial DNA samples. Which sounds like something straight out of Law and Order. These researchers basically became genetic detectives, hunting down random people who had no idea they were related to a dead king. Imagine getting a phone call asking, "Hey, can we test your DNA because you might be descended from medieval royalty?" That's either the best genealogy surprise ever or the weirdest scam call you've ever received. The DNA matched perfectly with Michael Ibsen, a cabinet maker who became famous for being related to a dead king. Ibsen was just making furniture in London when scientists showed up and told him he was Richard III's distant nephew. The mitochondrial DNA doesn't change much across generations, so it's like having a genetic fingerprint that stays consistent for centuries. Ibsen went from making cabinets to being the poster boy for medieval DNA research overnight. But here's where it gets weird though. Research found no match to male line Beaufort descendants, and this likely reflects at least one false paternity event in about 19 generations, since historical rates run around 1 to 2% per generation. Y chromosome DNA traces the father's side, and it was completely different from what they expected to find. That means somewhere between Richard III's time and now, somebody's mum was getting friendly with the mailman, if you know what I mean. It raised questions, but historians note false paternity across long genealogies is not unusual. The radiocarbon dating was all over the place at first. 2 radiocarbon dates initially appeared earlier than 1485, but isotope analysis showed a heavy freshwater and seafood component that can skew dates older due to the marine reservoir effect. And a Bayesian analysis then produced date ranges consistent with Richard's death. When you eat a lot of fancy fish and wine, the carbon isotopes in your bones get messed up and make you look older than you actually are. The scientists were like, well, this explains why our equipment was confused. Isotope analysis revealed a diet of luxury foods and exotic birds, proving this guy definitely lived like a king even if he died like trash. The scientists found evidence of freshwater fish, swan, crane, heron, and massive amounts of wine in his bones. This wasn't some peasant eating bread and porridge, this was a dude feasting on the most expensive food available. The isotopes in his teeth showed he grew up eating fancy stuff, then the isotopes in his bones showed he kept eating fancy stuff right up until he got his head caved in at Bosworth Field. The brutal injuries on the skull showed exactly how Richard III died in battle, multiple lethal head wounds including a blow that went straight through his brain. The back of his skull was completely cut away by some kind of bladed weapon, probably a halberd that sliced right through bone and exposed his brain. Then another weapon penetrated the right side of his skull and went all the way through to the left side. The French chronicler Jean Moliner wrote that one of the Welshmen struck him dead with a halberd, and the Ballad of Lady Bessie recorded that they struck his helmet until his brains came out with blood. Some historians like Michael Hicks questioned whether mitochondrial DNA alone is definitive, but the university's conclusion rests on multiple independent lines of evidence combined. The Leicester team basically had to build a bulletproof case using every scientific method available to convince the doubters. They combined location evidence, DNA matches, battle injuries, royal diet, curved spine, and historical records into one massive pile of proof that even the skeptics couldn't argue with anymore. Once they proved the bones were legit, though, a whole new problem started brewing. different groups started fighting over where to bury him properly. The University of Leicester had agreed that if Richard were found, the remains would be reinterred in Leicester Cathedral. But that didn't stop other people from having opinions. York wanted him because that's where the House of York came from. Westminster Abbey was making noise about being the traditional royal burial spot. Leicester was like, hey, we found him, we get to keep him. The Plantagenet alliance showed up claiming they represented Richard's descendants and launched a legal challenge seeking burial in York Minster instead. These folks took Leicester to court over burial rights for a 500-year-old corpse. The High Court had to actually sit there and listen to lawyers argue about where to put a dead king like this was some kind of important legal precedent. In May 2014, the court ruled there were no public law grounds to prevent reinterment in Leicester, so Leicester got to keep their parking lot king. The royal family basically said, not our problem, and declined to claim the remains, which is probably the most British response ever. I mean, you'd think they'd want to weigh in on where to put one of their predecessors, but apparently modern royals don't want to deal with medieval drama. Queen Elizabeth probably looked at this whole situation and thought, you know what, I have enough problems with living relatives, I don't need dead ones too. Leicester went all out with the reburial ceremony that was way more elaborate than anyone expected. They sealed the remains in a lead-lined ossuary and placed that inside an English oak coffin made by Michael Ibsen, the same descendant whose DNA helped identify Richard in the first place. The coffin got paraded through Leicestershire, retracing part of Richard's final route, and thousands of people lined up to pay their respects when the remains lay in repose. This wasn't just some quick burial, this was a full-scale royal event. The reburial service on March 26, 2015 was televised and everything, with the Archbishop of Canterbury showing up to officiate. They had memorial prayers for Richard III and the victims of the Battle of Bosworth, plus other conflicts from that era. Benedict Cumberbatch read a poem at the service because apparently even dead kings need celebrity endorsements now. Turns out Cumberbatch is a distant relative of Richard III, which is probably the most random family connection ever. Carol Ann Duffy wrote the poem specially for the occasion as poet laureate, so Richard got custom poetry from Britain's top poet. They built a special tomb in Leicester Cathedral made from Swaledale fossil stone on a Kilkenny marble plinth, which sounds fancy but basically means they spent serious money making this dead guy's grave look impressive. The tomb design was unveiled in June 2014 and became the centerpiece of the cathedral's redesigned interior. Most dead people get to rest in peace without strangers staring down at their final resting place, but Richard gets turned into a respectful memorial that people can visit. The King Richard III Visitor Centre opened on the site in 2014, costing £4.5 million and featuring artefacts from the dig, including Philippa Langley's Wellington boots and the archaeologist's hard hat. They're literally displaying work clothes as historical artifacts because everything connected to this discovery became museum-worthy. The visitor centre lets people view the original grave site through a glass floor, which gives you this weird connection to where the king actually spent 500 years underground. The irony is that Richard III became more famous and respected in death than he ever was in life, all because he got treated so badly the first time around. From most hated king to Leicester's biggest tourist draw is quite the character arc. The discovery put Leicester into the international limelight according to the city mayor, which means Richard finally got the recognition he always wanted. The whole legal battle over his remains cost way more than the original archaeological dig, but it proved people still cared deeply about this medieval king's legacy. After 500 years of being completely forgotten, Richard III managed to become the centre of attention all over again. Nobody could have predicted how this story would end. The most infamous king in English history got literally ground down by centuries of history and ended up under a parking lot, which is probably the most fitting metaphor for how reputation works. Richard III's rediscovery shows how archival research plus archaeology plus genetics can completely overturn long-standing myths that people accepted as fact for 500 years. The guy went from Shakespearean villain to archaeological celebrity just because someone bothered to actually look for evidence instead of repeating old stories. Sometimes the biggest historical revelations happen when you combine medieval maps, DNA testing, and a willingness to dig up random parking lots. Which bit of history would you want dug up, truth or myth? Drop a comment and let me know. And if you enjoyed this mix of sarcasm plus science, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories about dead people who refuse to stay buried.